All eyes have been on the PM's visit to China this week. President Xi describing the relationship between the two countries as strong and robust.
Meanwhile, in this year's budget, our government has allocated $9 million to a foreign interference work program for our ethnic communities.
Taiwan-based think tank Doublethink Lab is already studying foreign interference in New Zealand's Chinese community. They've surveyed 1,000 people specifically about Chinese Communist Party propaganda here.
One of the researchers is Aimin Lau, and I asked her what strategies her researchers found the CCP uses to spread propaganda in New Zealand.
Oftentimes it's through social media. A lot of times it's platforming of narratives on Western social media, notably those platforms that are actually censored in China. Yep. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. They have equivalents in China of those platforms, but those are Chinese social media platforms.
What about local Chinese media? Is that targeted by the CCP?
Yes. Chinese language media across the globe has been noted and has been reported to be targeted and co-opted and influenced by the Chinese Communist Party.
Is this happening here in New Zealand-based Chinese media? Do you know that?
I have yet to see any research delving into this topic. However, I don't think it is a stretch to say that it is not happening.
So in your research, you concentrated on individuals who are perhaps subjected to CCP propaganda, as you say. Why did you choose that, and what did you find?
There's a lot of research and reporting on how the Chinese Communist parties have ramped up their efforts to target overseas Chinese communities. They see overseas Chinese communities as their citizens, regardless of whether or not they actually have PRC citizenship.
Right.
This research really delves into the question is, are there certain factors that might make these communities more susceptible or not susceptible to pro-CCP propaganda, and exactly what is that impact? And what we found was actually quite a diverse range of answers, and I think that really speaks to how these overseas Chinese communities are very diverse, including in New Zealand.
Right, so why did you choose New Zealand?
We chose New Zealand primarily because of size. We surveyed both New Zealand and Malaysia. You
say you found diverse responses. Did you find that the Chinese community here is more in favour of the CCP propaganda or disbelieving of it?
So overall, levels of agreement of pro-CCP propaganda were higher in Chinese communities here in New Zealand. However, that is to say that we did see differences in terms of identification of what it means to be Chinese. So while there was overall levels of higher agreement with pro-CCP propaganda with those who identified as Malaysian Chinese or Chinese, we actually saw quite much higher levels of disagreement among the Taiwanese, the Hong Kongers, and the Singaporean Chinese. Overall, we did see higher levels of agreement.
Why is that? Is it just because of where they're getting their information, or do they not trust the New Zealand government?
We did find that those who were more likely to agree with pro-CCP propaganda also had very high Chinese social media use. Additionally, they were more likely to consume media from China or Chinese language news in New Zealand.
Did your research find out whether recently, with borders closed and the pandemic, originating in China, whether Chinese citizens here or Chinese residents here felt more disconnected with New Zealand because it might have been a level of blame?
We didn't examine for that in our research, I would say. However, I will say on that point, though, those who were more concerned with racism and race relations were more likely to agree with pro-CCP propaganda.
So if they'd experienced racism in New Zealand against them, they were more likely to agree with Chinese
if they experienced it or if they were concerned about it. Maybe hearing reports of racism might be more concerning to them. They might have more likelihood to believe in pro-CCP propaganda.
You say in your findings that the CCP is sowing distrust in government. Do you have examples of that?
It's more so about, making friends and winning influence rather than sowing distrust. It's more similar to just exerting influence through means of trade, economic relations, business engagement.
What about, say, sponsoring of political parties and things like that?
Political financing as well.
Political financing, yeah. Okay. At the moment, we've had our Prime Minister in China on an important trip. During that, President Xi said New Zealand is a friend, and there's been some criticism of our Prime Minister for not going hard enough on sort of the human rights issues like the Uyghurs in the camps. Does that make Chinese New Zealanders more likely to believe CCP propaganda if we're not publicly harsh about our relationship with China?
It's very difficult to say whether or not a political stance on the human rights abuses in China would make someone more susceptible to pro-CCP propaganda. There is an encroachment that we're seeing, and that some communities are concerned about that. And also, as well, there is coming to light more awareness globally about foreign transnational repression, which the Chinese diaspora bears the brunt of. This comes in the form of surveillance, suppressing dissent overseas through means of tactics and things like that. So,
do you have any evidence as to whether that is happening here in New Zealand?
I haven't seen research examining this quite yet. However, I think if there was to be more engagement with the community, there might be some things would come to light.
And on that, the New Zealand government has announced a program to look at foreign interference and engage with ethnic communities. Is that what you're talking about? What do you think they would find?
One thing might be interesting that they might find is that people might be reluctant to come forward.
Reluctant?
Reluctant to come forward, yes. We see this in other countries, such as Canada. We're seeing people who are reluctant to come forward because they know that what they might engage with politically sensitive topics might land their families in hot water back home.
We're just about to enter into a general election here this October. What activity, given your area of research, would you expect to see from the CCP during that kind of time?
I think from what I observed in other countries, there will be certainly pushes to sway and to influence people to vote for certain candidates. I think there will be some funding that needs to be closely examined, and I think also there needs to be more civic engagement with these communities.
So there will be a sort of like a campaign to influence?
There might be a campaign to influence. I wouldn't be surprised. I would say that the Chinese diaspora is the foreground of influence, and that is where the engagement and the research and the monitoring really needs to happen.
I'm in Lau there. And Doublethink Lab receives 5% of its funding from the Taiwanese government.